All right, so today I want to explore something that might sound a little uncomfortable at first, but that's kind of the point. We're going to be talking about Machiavellianism, not in politics, not in medieval Italy, but in the modern theme park space. Disney, Universal, massive corporations that sell joy, nostalgia, and escapism, while also making very calculated, very strategic decisions behind the scenes. Now, before this turns into a rant or a defense of corporate behavior, let me be very clear. This isn't me making a moral argument. This is me putting a philosophical lens over something we all interact with and asking, what's actually going on here? And so to understand any of this, we have to start with Niccolo Machiavelli himself. Machiavelli was a Renaissance political philosopher writing in a time of instability, 16th century to be exact. Constant war, fragile governments, leaders being overthrown left and right. And so, because of that context, his thinking was brutally pragmatic. In his seminal work, The Prince, Machiavelli makes a claim that still makes people uncomfortable today, that maintaining power and stability sometimes requires actions that would be considered immoral in everyday life. The famous shorthand for this is, the ends justify the means, though Machiavelli himself was probably more subtle than that. What he's really saying is, if the survival of the state or the organization is at stake, a leader may need to deceive, manipulate perception, or act ruthlessly to preserve stability. For example, a ruler might present himself as a compassionate and generous person while privately making harsh decisions that prevent chaos or collapse. The appearance of virtue matters more than virtue itself because perception is power. And that idea, power, perception, and stability, is what makes Machiavelli surprisingly relevant to modern corporations. When we translate Machiavelli into the modern corporate world, the parallels are almost unavoidable, especially at the executive level. CEOs aren't hired to be nice, they're hired to protect market share, maintain stability, and be competitors. A classic example comes from Walt Disney himself. When Disney was planning Walt Disney World, he didn't openly buy land in Florida under his own name. Instead, he created a web of dummy corporations, shell companies, so he could quietly acquire massive amounts of land at low prices. If sellers had known Walt Disney was behind those purchases, prices would have skyrocketed, and he knew that. That's deception. It's strategic, and it's profoundly Machiavellian. We see similar thinking later on with executives like Bob Iger or Brian Roberts at Comcast, especially through strategic acquisitions. Buying competitors, consolidating intellectual property, vertically integrating distribution. These moves aren't about creativity or guest experience in the abstract. They're about power, control, and long-term dominance. From a Machiavellian perspective, these executives are doing exactly what they're supposed to, securing the future of the state, which in this case is the corporation. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because Machiavellianism doesn't stop at the boardroom, it shows up inside the theme parks themselves. At the operational level, theme parks rely heavily on three Machiavellian principles. 1. Strategic manipulation. 2. Psychological influence. And 3. Manufactured scarcity and urgency. Take systems like Express Pass or Lightning Lane. On the surface, these systems are framed as guest-friendly, shorter waits, better experiences. But structurally, they're designed to guide behavior. Guests are nudged toward premium options, encouraged to optimize their day financially, and subtly conditioned to accept tiered access as normal. That's strategic manipulation, not malicious, but deliberate. Then there's scarcity. Limited time events like Epcot's Food and Wine Festival or exclusive seasonal overlays create the perception that if you don't go now, you're going to miss out. Exclusive merchandise works the same way. Scarcity drives impulse decisions. It increases spending while also making the experience feel special. And finally, urgency. Dynamic pricing, especially at Universal's Hollywood Horror Nights, for example, encourages early booking and higher spending by framing times as a constraint. Prices rise as availability shrinks, and suddenly waiting feels like a mistake. The guest feels in control, but the system is doing the steering. From a Machiavellian standpoint, this is elegant. You maximize profit, manage crowds, and maintain guest satisfaction, all while shaping perception. The guest leaves happy, even though their choices were heavily influenced. Now, here's where things get complicated, and honestly where most of the criticism comes from. Machiavellianism, by its very nature, embraces deception, manipulation, and power acquisition. Modern business ethics, on the other hand, emphasizes transparency, trust, and brand integrity. And these are not naturally compatible ideas. Theme park companies live in a constant balancing act. Push too far into Machiavellian territory, overprice, overmanipulate, overexploit scarcity, and you risk backlash. You lose trust. And trust is everything when your brand depends on loyalty, nostalgia, and emotional attachment. So what do companies do? They balance. Or maybe more accurately, they mask. Public-facing messaging emphasizes magic, inclusion, and guest-first values. Behind the scenes, Machiavellian logic governs pricing models, capacity control, and competitive strategy. Public relations and corporate ethics don't replace Machiavellianism, they soften it. They make it more palpable. In that sense, modern business ethics isn't the opposite of Machiavellianism. It's the counterweight that keeps it from becoming visible enough to cause reputational damage. So again, this isn't me defending or condemning these strategies. This is about understanding them. Machiavelli wasn't writing about theme parks, obviously because he was alive 400 years ago, but he was writing about power, perception, and survival in competitive systems. And once you start looking at Disney and Universal through that lens, a lot of things suddenly make sense. If nothing else, my hope is that this gives you a new way to think about the places we go to escape reality and the very real philosophies that shape them behind the scenes.